Hi, welcome to Trees with Don Leopold, Arbor Day edition. This is, I think, maybe our fourth or fifth year of doing this. We're coming to you live on this Earth Day of 2021 from the studios of ESF TV in Syracuse, New York. On today's show, we'll answer some questions and address some comments that have come in over the past year. I don't normally see these comments or questions until just a few days before we do this, and it's always very interesting to see what people are thinking out there, and they come from all over the world. We got one from Spain, for instance. We'll also be taking questions that come in on the YouTube comments section of the live stream. This year we have Audra again monitoring the chat stream. Hello, Audra.
Hi, Don. It's nice to join again this year.
Good, good. Looking forward to your help today. Thanks. We'll chat with you along the way here. So let's begin, and we have a number of questions that have come in over the past year, and so I'm going to address some of those. They should be of interest, if not about the particular tree species, but the topic in general. For example, one of the questions was, do you know of any medicinal trees? Well, yeah, there's some pretty interesting trees that have been used for medicinal purposes. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily good as far as effectiveness. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily safe, but there are a lot of trees that have been used for a long time medicinally. And maybe the most famous example, and the name would suggest that it's pretty important. The common name is Arborvitae, and Arborvitae is French for tree of life. It's also known as the northern white cedar, and the scientific name is Thuja occidentalis. So why is it called Arborvitae? Well, this is a pretty common tree in the northeastern United States. And it's remarkable for a lot of reasons, ecological reasons, before we get into the medicinal. And so I want to show you the foliage. It looks like an awful lot of plants that we call, trees that we call cedar, none of which are cedar, by the way. They're all members of the false cypress family. The true cedars are in the genus Cedrus, C-E-D-R-U-S, in the pine family. They're not at all, so everything that we call cedar, unless you see a true cedar, Cedrus atlantica or brevifolia or labani or deodara, they're the only true cedars. Most of what we call cedars are in the false cypress family, and they're evergreens. And the northern white cedar in particular is remarkable because it lives for about 1,700 years. So it's the oldest living tree in the northeastern United States. You'd have to go down to the southeast and the bald cypress to get any tree that lives older. And the bald cypress are known to live at least 2,400 to 2,800 years. So that's even more remarkable in terms of longevity. And they're also big. The northern white cedar really is common where you have lots of limestone. And the limestone might be rubble, it might be bedrock, or it might be deeper down in the soil, and when water moves through it, the water that's discharged is very high pH or high in calcium. So it's common in places that have a lot of calcium input. It also, in swamps where it's very common, in fact they're called cedar swamps, it actually reproduces by a tree simply falling over, and then the branches can become new trees. So it reproduces by layering, which is really kind of unusual within temperate forest tree species. So in the fall of 1535, Jacques Cartier and his crew sailed up the St. Lawrence River. And they spent the winter in a small camp near what is today Quebec City. As you can imagine, with all the snow and the cold, they were kind of stuck eating nothing but fish and meat. They didn't see anything green. This is a lot of kids' probably ideal dinner. No types of vegetables or fruits or anything. So very lean, and the men over many months developed a serious case of scurvy, and 24 sailors died. And so Jacques Cartier is the leader. Sought assistance from the local Native Americans, who made a tea for the crew by grinding up the foliage and bark and steeping it. And the men started to drink quite a bit of it, and they recovered after drinking the tea because of the high vitamin C content within the plant. And so Cartier eventually went back to France, and he brought this tree with him. This is probably the first North American tree to be introduced into Europe, and Cartier told the story and called it Arborvitae, or tree of life. And so it's really an interesting tree. It's also used, it's also one of the ingredients, if you know much about various liqueurs, in absinthe. It has a compound called thuone, which for many years was thought to be sort of behind the hallucinogenic effects that were believed to be associated with absinthe. It turns out that really people who had problems with absinthe simply just drank too much of it more than anything else. But it imparts a beautiful green color to various liqueurs. So that's probably the most famous example of a medicinal tree, and at least in the Northeast. There's another one that not that long after the Arborvitae was introduced to Europe, another tree was introduced to Europe, and that's very common, one that everyone knows, and that's the sassafras. And I have, sassafras is famous for having these highly variable leaves that can be lobed or unlobed. So sassafras has been used for centuries to treat all kinds of ailments. Again, not necessarily, I don't know if I'd give up a prescription in favor of sassafras to treat something. And the last few decades, sassafras is believed to be carcinogenic in very large volumes. But one thing about sassafras, and you can buy it in this form, is if you crumble the leaf and you shred it, just basically like this. Now I've just made gumbo filet, which is used to season gumbos, especially Louisiana gumbos. And so it does impart a very special flavor, and it thickens, like a little bit like okra, but not quite as effective as okra. But it is still used today, and so I probably have about $1 worth there. It's it's not cheap, but you can buy it from all kinds of spice places and at most grocery stores. So that's a little bit about medicinal trees. I just made quite the mess. Sort of related to medicinal trees, another question that came in was about the balm of Gilead, and whether the balm of Gilead that is in the tree video. So people were looking at the tree videos. We've had, over 200,000 views now on the tree videos, over 135 tree videos that Christopher and I made over the years. They're short, they're uncut, they're unedited. They're just meant to give you a brief introduction to some of the really neat native and non-native trees that you might find in the United States. One of the videos was about the balm of Gilead. And the balm of Gilead as a tree is, taxonomists have been trying to figure this out. They don't even know for certain what it is. It's believed to be most probably a hybrid between two cottonwood and poplar species. It also might be a variety of Populus balsamifera, the balsam poplar. But the key is that the balm of Gilead, regardless of what it really is, has really sticky resinous buds. And they're incredibly fragrant, almost sickeningly sweet in smell. And the reference to balm of Gilead as a common name is the reference to that very aromatic substance that is referred to in the Bible in 3 different places. Gilead is a region east of the Jordan River, and it's not just one plant that is believed to be responsible for those references. It might be related to another plant that's referred to as myrrh, but any plant that's referenced in the Bible will not be a plant you'll see in the United States. There are some other examples, and no populus species is mentioned in the Bible. I've looked for it, and it's just not there. So the balm of Gilead, some type of populus hybrid, and it is aromatic, and it is used, again, for medicinal purposes. So not related to medicinal, but related to populus. Populus is a really interesting group of trees. Some of them are root sprouters. One, Populus tremuloides, covers over 100 hectares in Utah. It's a very famous clone known as the Pando clone, and it's believed to be maybe the largest tree in terms of mass because it covers 100 hectares. It's one root system, and they just keep on sprouting, although it has been under decline recently. So populus, you could spend your whole life, and some people do studying populus. But another populus that someone asked about was how long does it take white poplar, Populus alba, to reach mature state? And so you can see why it's called Populus alba. Populus alba, I had a good fortune in April of 2012 to see this tree in its native locations in southwestern Turkey. It was just so neat to see this tree along streams. It's a very fast-growing tree. And so when the question is, how long does it take to reach maturity? If you're talking about sexual maturity, populuses will start to produce flowers in less than 10 years. Most trees take 20 or 30 years, or even more. If you're talking about mature state in terms of size, this tree in about 30 years will be pretty significant in size. It'll be 2 to 3 feet in diameter. Now, when it gets to 3 and 4 feet in diameter at the age of 50 to 80, then it starts to decline, and it's not unusual that it'll fall over, leaving behind a pretty large mass of root sprouts that will then take over the spot. So maturity, it's a fairly short-lived tree, and it's either sexually mature at a very young age, between 5 and 10, or its size maturity as early as 30 to 50. The downside is that, tree longevity, we've talked about this, I think, in last year's show. Tree longevity can vary from 50 for some species like populus to 5,500 years for the bristlecone pine. And so trees are not necessarily long-lived. I mean, some are much shorter lifespan than people, and some are incredible at over 5,000 years old. All right, so that's sort of some medicinal plant or tree stories and some stories about some other poplars. I think we'll move over to Audra to see if anybody has fed any questions into the live stream yet. Audra, do you have anything yet?
Yeah, we do have one question.
Okay.
So what is the most serious tree disease for the West Coast and the East Coast?
The most serious tree disease, I mean, it depends on the species. So for the East Coast, disease-wise, there are things emerging that are of great concern, like this oak wilt. I mean, if oak wilt starts off, I mean, oaks are so important to our economy and to the forestry industry. But already, the chestnut blight, now chestnut blight already played out. That might be the single most important disease of any tree in the eastern United States ever, because it basically eliminated about 25% of all the trees in the eastern deciduous forests were American chestnut, and it killed most of them. It reduced them to root sprouts. I mean, so they're still there. The work that's being done here by Dr. Bill Powell and his research team on making American chestnut disease resistant, and he's done it. It's just a matter now of getting the regulatory system to approve the release of these. But another real serious disease is for urban trees. The Dutch elm disease and elm yellows have caused catastrophic losses, and maybe worldwide more losses than for the chestnut blight, because American elm was so widely planted around the world, where American chestnut was pretty much confined, that species confined to the eastern United States. The western United States, I can't think of any disease that really jumps out, but I had a chance a couple years ago to visit some Port Orford cedar forest in northwestern California. And in terms of impact on a fairly rare tree to begin with, and a tree that's very valuable, the Phytophthora root rot is really bad on the Port Orford cedar, and it's a tree that isn't that common to begin with, and this disease is not helping it. So it really depends on what region of the eastern or western half of the United States, if it was historical or if it's current. There's always stuff happening, and that's why it's really an exciting time to be in the area of environmental biology, because there are so many things happening: insect problems and disease problems and invasive plant problems and climate change problems. This is not, it's not boring to be studying environmental biology right now. And a good place to do that, by the way, would be SUNY ESF.
All right, so we are going to be joined by a former host. Her name is Cassie. She graduated in 2019 from ESF. She is coming from Sacramento, coming into us via Skype from Sacramento, California. She works at the Office of Fish and Wildlife Service, and we are excited to have her on the show today.
Well, hello, Cassie.
Hi, Dr. Leopold. How you doing?
Fine, and we did the first one of these together years ago, and
Yep.
it's good to have you come back. And I guess we're going to have a chance to. I know you're on the clock here, so we can't take up too much of your time. But could you tell us a little bit about what your job is out there? So you graduated from environmental and forest biology a few years ago, and what are you up to now?
Right. Yeah. So right now I'm a part of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm an endangered species biologist out here working with all of the endangered species in the Coast Bay region and making sure projects don't put them in further endangerment.
So you were I mean, I know you spent most of your life up until then in Pennsylvania and New York. What do you see some of the big differences between the two places?
I mean, the outdoors here in California is just, there's nothing else like it. It's so beautiful out here. There's so many different environments and microclimates. You could explore forever, I feel like.
Well, you know, and you were one of my dendro TAs. You know trees very well. You heard about some of the trees out there, but is seeing believing? I mean, what is it that you've actually seen some of these that we rave about and tell students they've got to see in person? So what are some of those that people have to see in person?
I mean, giant sequoia, definitely. They're incredibly large. You can't even imagine it until you're standing next to one. And the coastal redwoods are also just incredible. The entire stands of them lining the Coast Range.
So, you know, everyone's always asked me, you know, what's your favorite tree? You know, and I mean, I've seen some cool trees all over the world, and I can think of maybe 100 that are my favorite. Do you have a favorite out there yet?
Out here, I don't know. I don't really think so. Although I do like the digger pines. They seem to look a lot like they look like deciduous trees to me from a distance, which I think makes them really unique.
Yeah, the digger pine has an unusual form. You know, it has the shape of an elmet, that semi-deliquescent shape. You want to talk about the cones a little bit? What makes digger pine especially interesting?
They're very large and armed cones that would probably kill you if it dropped on your head.
Yeah, they're almost the size of your head, and they weigh up to 10 pounds, and they have a tremendously recurved prickle that it's my understanding that they have killed people. I've walked through big stands of these in the Coulter pine, which is even bigger, and it's kind of eerie to walk under a bunch of pine trees that might kill you. So.
Yeah, I try to avoid walking under those.
So you apparently have some pictures that you're going to share with us, and could you show us a few of those and talk a little bit about the topics?
Yeah. Okay, so this picture was taken in the Redwood National Forest on the coast of California, of Northern California. And you don't really get the scale of it here. You can't see anyone, but these trees are just massive.
So that looks like the scene from Return of the Jedi. Is that close to where that was filmed?
I think so.
Do you know what grove in particular that was? That's not.
I'm not sure. It was off of a trail. And this is my dog Maple. We named both of our dogs after plants. So.
There's no surprise there.
Yeah.
So what other shots do you have there for us?
So here's a shot in, I think this is in Muir Woods, looking up at the coastal redwoods, how tall they are.
Yeah, so a lot of people, their first exposure to coast redwoods is Muir Woods, but the trees there aren't as spectacular as they are further north, and so it's always good to check out some of the further north stands. What is that there?
This is the world's largest Sitka spruce in Olympic National Park.
Okay, so I've been there. I have photographed that tree. You remember the diameter of that tree? Because you can't tell from the size of the picture.
No, I can't remember it. There was a sign at the base of the tree that tells you all about it and how old it is, and it was incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And unless you see these, there's simply nothing like these in the eastern United States. I mean, some of these are, 30, 40 feet in diameter. The sequoia is not the Sitka spruce. What do you have there?
This is back on the northern California in the Redwood National Park. Another picture of the coastal redwoods.
Mm-hmm. And the big sword fern in the base there. Okay.
And this is in Yosemite, looking up at the ridges of the valley.
Any trees in particular in Yosemite that were especially remarkable or memorable?
There was one of the groves that we went to, the Tuolumne Grove, that was just amazing. And it was amazing to know that it was an old commercial route.
Okay, what is that there?
This is a coastal redwood, and there's Michael, my husband, next to the tree. And I think there was just a bunch grown together, so it looks like one giant tree.
Yeah, so that tree, because it's able to basal sprout, you can get these basal sprouts will emerge. So you mentioned Michael, who I know very well as well. So how did the ESF degrees treat you both?
Pretty good. We got jobs, pretty immediately after graduating. There was a wait period for my job, but that was on the job's end, on HR's end, not for any other reason. So.
Well, good. So, to be fair, you were two of our very best students. So you shouldn't. If you have trouble finding jobs, then we really have some problems. But. So no regrets about going through the program or the major, because you had lots of other options here.
No, none at all. I loved my major, and I ended up on this crazy path that I didn't think I would be on, and now I have a full-time position and I make real money. It's very weird.
That's great, and and I wasn't even your advisor, so I can take no credit for anything, but. Okay, last tree here.
This looks like, I think it's Muir Woods again.
Yeah,
Not
so
sure what are all the
the word cathedral has been used probably more for this species than any other tree species in the world, and you just can't. It's a beautiful shot. It's really a very nice shot, but you can't appreciate what the feeling is unless you're actually there. And they're just these massive columns that go up up to 368 feet tall, which is pretty amazing. So you got to see these things, but you got to come back to the east at some point too. So
Yeah.
not a tree. It doesn't look like a tree. What is that?
That's an elephant seal on the beach of Drake's Estero in Point Reyes National Seashore. They come up onto the beach around February and March every year and fight each other. So that was one of the shots I got.
Yeah, my wife and I were out in Northern California 2 years ago, and we were eating at a restaurant where there were, I don't know which animal it was similar but big, and they just were laying on. There's some big, like massive slugs, 2,000-pound slugs.
Yeah.
Really, really cute. But I enjoyed seeing the trees much more out there than any animals. So. Anything else you want to share with us?
I think that was
okay. Audra's got a question for you.
We do have a question. So, Cassie, we've heard all about your time out in California. Do you miss it here at the ESF TV station and setting up on camera?
I actually do. That was a fun part of my time at ESF, and I wish I had some more IT stuff that I did out here, because it's mostly writing for me right now, especially working from home.
Well, I should mention that you do something else, because I have an example right here, one of your mugs, and I haven't broken the one that I got from you years ago. I keep on waiting for it to, fall out of my hands, but this is one that I'm not allowed to have, apparently. It's only for me to use once a year when I do this. This is the perk I get for doing this, but you do very nice work, ceramic
Thank you.
work, and it is apparently available through Etsy or somewhere. Is that the...
Yep, yeah, I'm on Etsy. I'm on vacation mode right now. I haven't been able to make a lot of stuff lately, but I'm making new things. It's in the works.
Yeah, and it all doesn't say ESF TV, right?
No.
That's okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us, Cassie. Give my regards to Michael, and always enjoy seeing pictures. And if you ever want to send some big cones out here, I'm always happy to put them somewhere.
I have some for you. I'll send
Great.
some.
It's great to see you. Thanks for
Thank you,
joining us.
Cassie.
Bye.
All right. Well, so most of our graduates have very good jobs or go on to grad school and then get very good jobs. So I'm going to go through a few more of the topics that came up while we were looking through the comments from last year that came in anywhere from a year ago to just a few days ago. So someone wrote in that they had a blue spruce and it was declining on a heavy clay soil somewhere in the Midwest, it was Missouri maybe. And they noticed there were a bunch of spores all over the foliage and thought maybe there was some connection between these declining blue spruces and the spores. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Colorado spruce. It's really a better common name, because if you see Colorado spruce in the 4 states in which it is very common in the Rockies, it's rarely blue. It's occasionally blue, and when it's blue, but it's normally green, and it's very narrow in where it occurs. It's only about four states. So it grows in these lower elevations of what is called the montane zone. And the montane zone is a fairly hot, dry place. It gets about 18 inches of precip a year, so we get about 39, 40 in Syracuse. And so it really does not do well in poorly drained sites. Now, if you see it out there, it is often along streams. In fact, if you do any fly fishing along some of these streams, it's often the main tree you'll see. But it's just so much drier there to begin with. And so the one type of site condition that Colorado spruce does not thrive under in the eastern U.S. is poorly drained soils. Now, poorly drained soils often predispose trees to the things that you actually see happening. For example, fungal diseases. And Colorado spruce does get a number of fungal diseases in the Northeast or in the eastern United States. And they're going to be especially an issue when the soils are poorly drained. So the best thing is to make sure that any tree you buy is sited properly. And if you understand a little bit about where it's native and where it really thrives naturally, then it's easier to find the right place in the landscape. So there are some really fine conifers in the western United States that really thrive in the east. Ponderosa pine's another, white fir's another. But none of these, because the west is so much drier, none of these will do well on a poorly drained site. If you have a poorly drained site and you want to put a tree there, don't even think about the western conifers. You have to start thinking about some of the eastern United States swamp species, of which there are many dozens, and they'll thrive if you have poorly drained soils, or if you have standing water even, like the bald cypress will grow in 3 to 10 feet of water for up to 2,000 years, so not a bad choice for a really wet site. And it'll grow really well, even in upstate New York, so it's not like, these are really tender species. So. All right, we got a question of Audra.
Yes, we do have a question in the chat. Is the coefficient of wetness scale the best way to determine where a tree naturally occurs?
The best way to determine the affinity of a tree to wet soils is to go to USDA plants, where you'll see the wetland indicator status mentioned for each tree species, shrub species, and herbaceous species of everything in the United States. And so, for example, like red maple, you'll see, the neat thing is that it's actually fine-tuned by region, because as you go from one region to another, sometimes a tree will have more or less affinity to wet soils. But it's a very simple classification scheme. It's highly subjective. It's just based on people seeing a particular tree in wetland or not wetland consistently over time. So there are trees that are given a status called obligate, and that category means that almost 99.9 times out of 100, that tree is found in a wetland. All right, so that's going to tolerate wet soils. There are other trees like sugar maple that are called facultative upland species. 99.9% of the time, they're in an upland. You're not going to find those in wetlands. Don't plant them in a wet soil. And there's other categories in between. For example, red maple, which is found in deep water swamps. It's found on the driest ridges. It's given a category of, typically it's facultative, meaning it's in wetlands and non-wetlands just about the same amount of time. So that's a real simple way. In fact, if you go to a lot of other places, we'll list the wetland indicator status. It's a real quick way to see whether that tree might thrive on a poorly drained site. For example, river birch, Betula nigra, well, the common name suggests its affinity to wetlands, and it'll thrive in a poorly drained site. What that doesn't tell you is that when they're planted, a lot of these wetland trees actually do really well on really dry soils. And so it's kind of counterintuitive, but a lot of the really good urban trees are actually wetland trees. Swamp white oak is a good example. Silver maple, although it's not a good tree for other reasons, there are a lot of these wetland trees, sycamore and cottonwood, that tolerate extreme drought. And if you think about it, it's because a lot of these wetlands are flooded in the spring, but in the summer, during the growing season, that water table is way below the root surface. And so these trees are probably best adapted to the widest range of soil moisture you could possibly have in the landscape. And so it gets back to understanding the tree species. A lot of what we do in dendrology, the course that I teach, it's the oldest, largest dendrology course in the country. It's typically a very taxonomic course that, you know, the flower structure isn't of great interest to most of us, I mean, including me. Although flowers are beautiful, the actual differences between, you know, one species and the next, like the oaks and their flowers, it's not particularly exciting. So we spend most of our time in dendrology in the lecture talking about the natural history, the ecology, trying to understand the species. If you understand the species, you can manage it, you can conserve it, you can plant it, you can do all kinds of things that without that understanding, the taxonomy alone isn't going to help really promote that particular tree species for any purpose. And so that's why we really focus on some of those life history characteristics, the traits that really make these trees so different from one another. Another question, Audra?
Yes, we do. In the chat, Patrick says, Don, love your videos. I live on a farm in Ontario, Canada. I plant seedlings every year. How do I protect my seedlings from mice and rabbits?
So when it's mice, rabbits, deer, muskrats, if it's in a wetland setting, are really important varmints to protect your planted trees from. Probably one of the best ways, and they're not that expensive, they're called tree tubes. They're different kinds of composition, they're different heights, different sizes. You can get them from some of the like forestry suppliers and other places that sell things for forest regeneration and other purposes. But you can do, if you have just a few, you can put, I put chicken wire around my Japanese maple because I was concerned Japanese maples are really susceptible to deer, not browsing, but deer rubbing. Deer can completely destroy a lot of trees, not by eating, although they do that too, but also by girdling the tree with their rubbing. A tree tube will take care of all that. You can use tree wraps and other types of things, but a tree tube, it's very easy. There's nothing to it to install, and they're not that expensive. So I would definitely invest in, even if you've got hundreds. I mean, if you look at any big forest restoration project in upland or wetland setting, I don't think I've ever been to one where tree tubes were not automatically put on the tree. Otherwise, you're just throwing a lot of money away. You can, if you've got a few rabbits and a few deer, you can spray them every 2 to 3 weeks with that spray that smells. I mean, you want to throw up while you're applying it, but it's somewhat effective. But it's you got to do it regularly throughout the whole growing season. I think a tree tube makes a lot more sense. Okay, so another question that came in from someone who saw some of the tree videos. They saw the black maple video, Acer nigrum, and they were kind of intrigued by it because I think I mentioned that it's more drought tolerant than sugar maple. And so they planted it on a dry slope in the Midwest, and we're really pleased with how well it grew. It's a great tree for dry slopes. But they were wondering what are some other tree species that might thrive on similarly dry slopes of the Midwest, especially if they're high in calcium because they're on limestone bedrock. And that's another issue that a lot of trees don't do well on high pH or high calcium soils. So I just wanted to mention a few, and this is highly biased because I grew up in northern Kentucky on the bluffs of the Ohio River, and I grew up with all these trees, including black maple. And you don't know at the time what that experience is doing to you, but they're beautiful forests with really rich understories of wildflowers. Not now because of deer, but other tree species that you would see regularly on these really dry slopes, high in calcium, were Ohio buckeye, Aesculus glabra, the Kentucky coffee tree, which in New York is one of our rarest trees. There's only one site in the whole state. But in the dry Midwestern slope forest, it really does well. It's also a root sprouter, so once you get it established, it'll spread throughout the woods and openings. A shingle oak. Shingle oak is not well known by most people. It's technically a red oak, but it has an unlobed leaf. It kind of looks like a strap, and it's a real glossy leaf. It's beautiful. So shingle oak is a real common oak on these dry slopes. Bur oak, chinkapin oak. Chinkapin oak will live 400 or 500 years, thrives under these dry conditions. Hackberry, not particularly incredible in terms of its beauty, but really functional and pretty bulletproof in terms of almost any insect disease issue. It just doesn't have a tremendous aesthetic value, but it's very functional. A rock elm and slippery elm, or red elm. Now, the problem with those trees thrive under those conditions, but they don't thrive because of Dutch elm disease and elm yellows. So those are real problem species, real problem diseases for the rock and the slippery or red elm. Blue ash was once a really good option for real dry, high in calcium sites, but blue ash is being hammered by the emerald ash borer. Now, it's not as susceptible as white ash and green ash, but it's still it's still basically being lost to the emerald ash borer. It's a beautiful oak, a beautiful ash that you see if you drive throughout central Kentucky on the horse farms. Used to see big bur oaks and big blue ashes widely spaced on these savanna-like places. So related to that group of trees, I mentioned rock elm, and someone else wrote in. They asked, do all rock elms have corky branches? So some trees, there's just a few, they're easy to remember. Some trees have this exaggerated growth on their twigs. A sweet gum is one, bur oak is another, and rock elm, of all the elms, rock elm, well, there's also winged elm, Ulmus alata. Rock elm is almost Tomasii, and it's very common in the northern United States forest. Rock elm is unfortunately also susceptible to Dutch elm disease and the elm yellows, which kills all of the native elm species eventually. But there's still plenty of elms around because they can reproduce at an early age and they hop around the landscape. And as fewer and fewer elms are in the landscape, the densities get such that the disease doesn't catch up with the trees as quickly. So there's some really nice elms around. So rock elms don't always have corky branches. I mean, if you think of a lot of tree traits, there aren't many tree traits that are always. There's so much variability in trees that's what makes learning trees sometimes difficult, because there's nothing that is absolute in a lot of biology. These are living organisms, always under change. So rock elms typically have corky branches, but they don't always. If you look at other traits, and usually what you do for identifying any tree is you look for 3 to 5 of the best traits, never just one, because that'll get you in trouble at some point. So rock elms have the sharpest of all the buds. So you won't see that this time of year because they're expanding, but in June and July when those buds set, they're as sharp as a pin. I mean, they're painfully sharp, and they're longer. And so that is a very consistent trait. That's actually more consistent than corky branches. The bark on rock elm, if you cut into it, it has very distinct coloration. It's alternating between white layers and brown layers, identical to American elm. So you're not going to separate the barks on that trait between American elm and rock elm. But if you look at the sharp buds, you look at the corky branches, then you can separate rock elm from the other elms. The other thing that rock elm does that is very unusual versus American elm is that it does, so American elm has this beautiful vase-shaped habit. That's why it was so popular. I mean, it didn't have any spectacular flowers or anything. It was the form. It was extraordinary. Rock elm doesn't have that habit. It has a single, straight stem. It looks like most trees look. It doesn't have that deliquescent form. And so collectively, those traits are used to separate rock elm from the other elms. And then the slippery elm is the third common elm in the Northeast. And if you're kind of confused about those, just take a look at the tree videos that are posted on this channel, and you can separate them all pretty readily. Okay, we have another question that came in.
Yes, so a person watching has entered the chat and says, I am on a tree board in a village in western New York. I would love to hear your favorite street tree recommendations given power line constraints, road salts, etc.
So that's a really important question, and it's also very complicated. So I would say to that person to send me an email at djleopold@esf.edu. I regularly send out a list of the best trees, native and non-native, for any size, for any condition in the urban state in upstate New York. There's simply way too many to start going through, and I would probably end up leaving out some and include some I shouldn't. So please send me an email. I get emails every day from all around the country looking at tree pictures, asking questions about trees. It's easy for me to send you the list, and that way you'll have it in front of you, and you'll have lots more options than if I just told you 2 or 3, which, there's actually 20 or 30 or 40 native and 20, 30, 40 non-native trees for any size, for any urban condition. So please send me that email. And if for some reason that email you lose track of what it is, or if I got it wrong, just go to the ESF website and you can easily track me down. So.
Yes, we have one more for you. So, Don, I am concerned about invasive species, specifically, I hope I pronounce this okay, Ailanthus altissima. This is a Zone 5 plant, and I live in Zone 4B. Should this still be a concern?
Well, so if you go to, there's a really neat site. It's called BONAP, B-O-N-A-P. It's the Biota of North America project. And you can find a range map for every single native and non-native tree, actually any plant, in North America. So you can see exactly, based on that map, it's a county map, shows exactly where Ailanthus altissima is in the world, in the United States, not the world. And you can see exactly how close it is to you. Now, the fact that you're in 4B, you might be okay anyway. Ailanthus altissima, the tree of heaven, is it's called Tree of Heaven because it just reaches to the heavens so readily. But there's nothing heavenly about it. I mean, it is ecologically, it's one of the neatest trees there is because of what it can do. It can colonize the most degraded urban areas, and then the more you cut it, the more it spreads. It's a real serious problem a little further south in central New York. We see it in central New York, but it's mostly in like the local Oakwood Cemetery and parks and where people see it and they start cutting it, and it just keeps on coming back. Now, you can control it, but that's a different issue. We won't get into the ways to control these. It does spread readily, not only by root sprouts, but also by samaras, twisted samaras that are widely dispersed by the wind. It's a serious plant, but I think you might be okay. Now, that's with the current climate or historical climate. The climate, at least in upstate New York, it's not gotten warmer, it's gotten wetter, so some species are favored by that, some are not. But there are places where the climate is warmer. And in those places, all those things that thrive under warmer conditions are going to be marching towards you. So it is a real serious invasive, and if you ever do see it, I've actually seen the first stages of some of these invasive species coming into an area, and you alert people, and they just don't get it, and then it quickly is almost too late. So keep an eye on it. Another question?
Yes, we have one more. Should you fertilize trees? And if so, when in their lifespan, and what fertilizers should you use?
Well, so tree fertilization, there are people who are professionals that are trained and certified. They're certified by the International Society of Arborists. And it's sometimes it's often best to start with professionals if there's an issue, a concern about a tree. Generally, if you just wanted to sort of, give the trees an annual dose of fertilizer, they don't need it under most conditions. But now around a landscape, around a home where that natural nutrient cycle has been disconnected, where there isn't organic matter in the soil, then a regular fertilizer, but it's something that you don't use lawn fertilizer. Lawn fertilizer is very high in nitrogen. That's the first of the three numbers, NPK, and often lawn fertilizers are like 31 and then smaller numbers for the P and K. So you'd use something. In fact, I just bought some just a few days ago. I think it's a 12-12-12, so it's balanced between NPK. And I'll put that, on trees that maybe could use, maybe they're not growing as vigorously, maybe the site conditions aren't particularly good. Fertilization, watered in, if it's just sitting there on the top, not watered in, it's not going to be very effective. But fertilization is helpful. Just don't overdo it. It'll tell you on the bag what the dose rate should be. That is not one of those things you want to, like eating cake. It's okay. You eat an extra piece of cake. You don't want to double dose the fertilizer. All right, so I have at least two other questions that have come in that I want to definitely get to because I think they're interesting. But one is about names of tree species. So the specific epithet, which is the second part of a scientific name, you might see the word Virginiana, Alleghaniensis, Pennsylvanica. And then when so those are scientific names that are firm. They're on trees that have been accurately defined, and those names are not going to be changed unless the genus name is changed because of some taxonomic decision. Somebody wanted to know why is something called Virginiana when in fact you don't see as much of that tree in Virginia as you do maybe in New York, and it's because that if the trees are actually described technically by a taxonomist, and if they're accurately described, whatever name is chosen, that name is stuck with that entity. You just can't be switching species names around because you don't think it fits the name very well. The best example is Picea mariana, which is black spruce. Mariana means of Maryland. There's like one stand in all of Maryland. It's a boreal species. Mariana is so far removed from reality, so far removed from being correct, but the tree was accurately described, and so you can't switch the name around just because you realize that, now that you know the range better, that was really a bad choice for a species name. So don't always expect the species name to most accurately tell you what is really going on with that tree species. All right, I want to get to some leaves that show one of the points because this comes up a lot, and that's with the oaks. There's two groups of oaks. There's red oaks and there's white oaks, and the red oaks have a really distinctive feature. They have at the end of each lobe they have a bristle tip, and it's like a fine. It's like almost hair-like. It's so fine. There's all these white oaks that some people sometimes think they're seeing a bristle tip. Now, white oaks as a group don't have bristle tips. The wood does not have, or the wood has tyloses in it in the vessels or their plugs, which makes them able to be used for storing liquor and whiskey and Chardonnay and other things. White oaks live a lot longer. White oaks, the acorns take just 1 year to produce, and they germinate right away. Red oaks are quite different. So the question came in about they've seen a swamp white oak with leaves that have a bristle tip or at least pointed. Is it a hybrid? Well, first of all white oaks hybridize. So only with the white oaks. White oaks cannot hybridize with the red oak. So if you think you see a bristle tip, it's not a hybrid between a white and a red oak. They don't hybridize. But all the white oaks, and there are a lot, Alba, Prinus, Muhlenbergii, I mean, just dozens across the United States. So this is an example of Quercus bicolor, the swamp white oak. And, you know, it does look like there's a bristle there. It's a little, sometimes there's a little nubbin, technically, the technical term is called mucronate, but it's not a long, slender bristle. So this is swamp white oak. It's quite variable. But what that person might have seen is a common oak in the eastern United States. This really looks like it has bristle tips. This is another white oak. This is Quercus muhlenbergii. It's the chinkapin oak. This is the oak that I grew up with in northern Kentucky. It's a beautiful oak, beautiful leaf. It almost looks like it's made out of leather. And it sure looks like it has bristle tips. In fact, if you could look at it really close, you would see a really distinct dot. It's almost like it's an elongated dot. And that's a real good example of a mucronate. It's not a bristle. I mean, taxonomists make this call. And so these are both white oaks, not the white oak. The white oak is Quercus alba. It has much more rounded lobes. So if you do think you're seeing bristle tips, look more carefully to make sure it really is a bristle tip or if it's a one of these mucronates. There are a lot of other differences between the red and white oaks. And really for the oaks, they're really best identified by using one or more, or usually maybe 3 or more traits, because any one trait might slip you up a little bit. Any other questions there, Audra?
I think we're all set.
Okay, so a question came in from Spain about they have a sugar maple in Spain they planted, and it's 30 years old, and it's not flowering yet, and they're kind of getting impatient, and they were wondering, you know, when should it start flowering? Well, you know, there's a lot of really great information out there on trees. Some books by the Forest Service called The Silvics of U.S. Forest Trees. They're online, and just a remarkable amount of information about the life history of these species. And if you look at that resource, and you know, it's based on observations on many, many thousands of trees. So it looks like sugar maple typically doesn't start to flower until about age 25. So in Spain, which is going to be, you know, hotter and drier, it wouldn't be unusual for a tree to not start those reproductive tendencies until it's even older. If it's about 30, it should start to flower more. Now, the thing about sugar maple, they also want to know where are the fruits. Well, you can't have fruits without the flowers. And so the thing with flowering is that sugar maple has both sexes on the same tree, often in the same flower, not always. Sometimes the bottom flowers on the tree, the bottom canopy, sometimes those flowers are predominantly male, and most of the male and female flowers are further up in the canopy. And so you have to have male and female flowers, and you have to have enough flowers for fruit production. So I would say that unless this tree is actually dying, that it should start producing fruit fairly soon. Now the flowers are pollinated. For maple, they're pollinated by both wind and insect pollination. So there really shouldn't be any issue about a lack of pollination. That's sometimes the reason why fruits don't happen. But in this case, pollination should not be the issue. Another question that came in was, can pitch pine needles be steeped for tea? And whether you know pitch pine or not, Pinus rigida, it's a common 3-needle pine in the northeast United States. The question really applies to pine needles anywhere in the world. So you can steep any pine needles of any species from anywhere in the world. You can make a tea out of them. And if you read the literature, it suggests that there's vitamin C in it, and there's other things that are beneficial. It's like, you know, like a mild turpentine if you like that type of taste. The problem with sometimes when people refer to trees with common names, like Norfolk Island pine. So I'll tell you that you can steep any true pine, anything in the genus Pinus, but not any plant called pine, because there are plants called pine. The Wollemi pine is probably the most famous example. They're not anywhere related to the true pines. And so be very careful. Norfolk Island pine, if you think that you can make a nice tea out of it, it'll make you very sick, so don't do it. So any species in the Pinus genus you can do, but not any plant that's called pine, because a lot of plants called pine, princess pine is a little ground cover, a little club moss. It certainly isn't a pine. So that's the problem with common names. They're so inexact. Okay, Audra?
We do have one more question. It's actually a personal question. I'm going to be moving back home after I graduate this year to the northern Catskill Mountain area, and I was wondering if you had any tree recommendations for planting there.
Well, so it's all about cold hardiness when you start thinking about trees, and thankfully there are maps that show you the cold hardiness for any location in the United States. And if you get into places like the Catskills, where the elevation will really control the cold hardiness, it's really important to take a good look at those maps. As you get higher in elevation, there are less options. There are tree species that are cold hardy at the highest elevations in the Catskills and in the Adirondacks. For example, paper birch, Betula papyrifera, one of the most beautiful trees native to the eastern United States. It's actually a boreal species. The problem with it is it only lives for 75 or 80 years, but that's a really great, if you're looking for something really aesthetic, that is a really fine starting point. When you start thinking about, well, I love oaks, well, that's where you start to get into some trouble, because you have to go to the most cold hardy oak, like northern red oak, Quercus rubra. You could probably grow that anywhere in the Catskills, but there are other oaks that are simply not cold hardy enough to do well. So really what you want to do is think about what you're thinking about would be nice, and then every horticultural guide, every tag that you buy in a nursery, you get in a nursery, will have the cold hardiness, because that is the single most important thing to make sure you're within the right cold hardiness zone before you plant anything.
Great, thank you, Don.
All right, well, apparently the hour has flown by. I didn't even get to all the questions here, but it is time to wrap up. So I want to thank Cassie for joining us. It was a treat to see her and her pictures and hear about California, which is, if you want to look at trees, that's the place to go. It's incredible. I don't know if I'd want to live there with earthquakes and fires and a lot of other things, but it makes you appreciate when you get out there how beautiful the place is. I want to thank Audra for monitoring our chat. Audra?
Yes, thank you, Don, for being here today. It was a pleasure, and thank you for all the people who participated and sent questions in. And if you'd like to send more questions in, this is going to be an annual event, and of course we'll have Don on for other events as well. And we'd love to have some questions rolling in throughout the year for next Arbor Day.
Good. And if you're here next year, it means you didn't graduate, so we don't want you to be here next year, I guess. So. My thanks to all the people here at ESF TV that made this broadcast possible. Last year, I think we did this with only 2 people. This year, it's the most people I've seen in a long time, all socially distanced, of course, in different rooms. I'm Don Leopold. Thank you for joining us so long from Syracuse, New York.